When solitude becomes a prison and every shadow whispers secrets of hidden eyes, isolation twists into a living nightmare. Tonight, three souls confront the terror of their own minds, a slow descent into paranoia where nothing is as it seems. Enter, if you dare. In a remote corner of the country, Samuel lived alone in a time-worn cabin far removed from the nearest town. His days passed with quiet routine, punctuated by the rustling of pages as he read by lamplight and the measured steps he took along creaking wooden floors. Over the years, his isolation had fostered a relentless introspection, but it also gave rise to a persistent, gnawing suspicion, an uneasy sense that he was not entirely alone. Samuel's life had once been full of promise, but circumstances had driven him into seclusion. With no family to call his own and no friends to rely on, he accepted the solitude as both refuge and burden. Yet as the months turned to years, a peculiar doubt began to take root. At first, it was a whisper at the edge of his mind, a vague notion that something lurked in the spaces between the trees, watching him with unblinking eyes. It was a thought he would dismiss during the day, attributing it to the isolation itself, a byproduct of a mind starved for human connection. But as twilight bled into the darkness each evening, Samuel's unease grew. While tending to his modest supper in the silence of his kitchen, he would pause as if expecting to see a figure reflected in the window, a shape that should not be there. Each time when he looked, there was nothing but the dim outline of the barren forest beyond. The sensation, however, would persist, a silent accusation that his solitude was being intruded upon. Night after night, Samuel began to document these moments in a battered notebook. He recorded every subtle anomaly, a misplaced book on his shelf, the sensation of being observed as he stepped from one room to another, the feeling that unseen eyes trailed his every movement. The pages filled with careful observations, and the words began to morph from simple descriptions into pleas for understanding. He questioned whether the isolation he had chosen might have awakened something that fed on his loneliness. One particularly long evening, as a chill settled into the corners of his modest home, Samuel's thoughts spiraled into darker territory. He recalled a time, long ago, when the cabin was part of a small settlement. Rumors had swirled about disappearances and strange happenings, stories dismissed as folklore by most, yet they now resonated with him. Was it possible that the land itself harbored secrets, or that the spirits of those lost had found a way to intrude into his quiet life? The doubt festered, feeding into a burgeoning paranoia that gripped him with increasing intensity. Samuel began to see patterns in the mundane, a creak in the floor at precisely the same moment each night, a soft exhalation in the silence that was not his own. In his solitary state, every minor irregularity was magnified, every whisper of wind a potential threat. His once methodical routine gave way to sleepless nights spent pacing the creaking boards, his eyes straining into every dark corner, searching for evidence of that unseen presence. As the days wore on, his writings became more frantic. He noted that the sensation of being watched was not limited to the perimeter of his cabin. It seeped into every room, every passageway. Even in the quiet of his study, as he tried to concentrate on his books, he could feel the weight of an unseen gaze. Samuel's internal monologue grew increasingly desperate. Was his isolation unearthing something ancient and malevolent, or was his mind starved of companionship, fabricating an enemy that lurked only within? The turning point came one night when Samuel, exhausted by his own ceaseless worry, sat motionless in his favorite armchair. The stillness of the room was absolute, and yet he was acutely aware of every heartbeat. It was then that the feeling of another presence, more tangible than ever before, overwhelmed him. In that suspended moment, he felt a subtle shift, as if a silent observer had drawn near. His breath caught. He could not pinpoint a sound, nor could he see anything that defied the ordinary. But in his heart, he knew the isolation had morphed into something else, an intrusion upon his very soul. In the aftermath, Samuel's writings took on a tone of resignation mixed with dread. He described a growing acceptance of the idea that his seclusion might have invited a presence that now clung to the edges of his reality. His once pristine routine had become a series of evasive maneuvers, each step calculated to avoid the imagined eyes that haunted his every move. The line between reality and the dark recesses of his mind blurred until he could no longer tell where one ended and the other began. Even as he documented his descent into paranoia, Samuel clung to a fragile hope that he might reclaim control over his thoughts. But deep down, the isolation had left its mark, a mark of vulnerability that no amount of rational thought could erase. In the quiet moments before sleep, when the world outside was reduced to a tapestry of shadows, he would whisper to himself that he was safe, that the intruder was merely a figment of his lonely mind. Yet with each passing night, the doubt grew stronger. The pages of his notebook filled with confessions of fear and uncertainty, each entry a testament to the relentless grip of isolation. Samuel's world had shrunk to the size of his cabin, every surface a potential canvas for the manifestations of his paranoia. His solitude had become both his refuge and his prison, a space where every thought was magnified and every shadow whispered of unseen dangers. In the end, Samuel's struggle was not with an external force, but with the insidious nature of his own mind, a mind that, isolated from the warmth of human connection, had turned against him. His story became a somber reflection on how isolation can breed doubt, and how even the most rational soul can succumb to the terror of its own perceptions. For Samuel, the lurking doubt was not a visitor that could be banished. It was a part of him, a dark mirror reflecting the deep unspoken fears that come with being utterly alone. Elena had long retreated from the bustling city life, seeking solace in a cramped apartment on the edge of an ever-changing urban landscape. Surrounded by the indifferent hum of a metropolis, she had chosen seclusion over superficial connections, preferring the company of her own thoughts to the empty chatter of acquaintances. Yet as the days bled into nights, her isolation began to weigh heavily on her mind, stirring a deep-rooted paranoia that grew with every silent hour. Her apartment, though modest, had once been a sanctuary, a place where she found peace and a semblance of control. But over time, that peace dissolved into a creeping dread that pervaded even the most ordinary moments. It began subtly, an unaccountable feeling of being watched as she prepared her morning tea, a fleeting glance in the mirror that made her question the reflection that stared back. The mirror, a simple object hanging on her wall, gradually morphed in her perception into a portal of unsettling possibility. Each morning, Elena would fix her hair and apply her makeup with meticulous care. But as she looked into the mirror, she couldn't shake the sensation that the reflection was not entirely her own. There was an unfocused gleam behind her eyes, a hint of something else that lurked in the depths of that glass. At first, she dismissed it as the product of exhaustion, a mere trick of the mind wrought by long hours of solitude. But as the days passed, the feeling intensified. Elena began to notice inconsistencies in the mirror's image. Occasionally, when she turned away for a moment, the reflection would linger longer than it should, as if it possessed its own will. In the quiet moments between the routine tasks of her day, she found herself scrutinizing the mirror with mounting anxiety. The reflection seemed to adopt subtle expressions that she did not feel, an almost imperceptible furrow of the brow or a slight tilt of the head. The once familiar image became an enigma, a silent witness to her growing paranoia. Her internal dialogue, once calm and methodical, now raced with questions. Was the mirror simply reflecting her own self-doubt, or had it become a repository for something darker, a presence born from the void of isolation? Elena's thoughts spiraled as she documented her observations in a journal, noting every irregularity and every moment when her reflection appeared to defy expectation. The entries grew more desperate, tinged with the fear that she was losing control over her own mind. Even the simplest daily activities became fraught with anxiety. While brushing her hair, Elena would catch herself pausing mid-stroke, her eyes fixed on the mirror, as if searching for confirmation that she was still in control. At times, she would find herself whispering reassurances to her reflection, pleading silently for it to return to the familiar visage she once knew. But the mirror offered no comfort, only the silent, relentless echo of her isolation. As the weeks turned into months, Elena's paranoia seeped into every corner of her life. The reflection began to act in ways that defied logic. On more than one occasion, she recalled locking the door before leaving her apartment, only to find upon her return that the mirror's surface bore a faint, ghostly imprint of another face, a face that vanished as soon as she looked directly at it. These moments, brief yet searing, convinced her that her solitude had awakened something within the glass, a presence that was both a part of her and utterly alien. In her darkest moments, Elena questioned whether the relentless solitude had fractured her mind. Was she imagining the anomalies, or was the mirror truly harboring a secret that gnawed at her sanity? The isolation, once a chosen retreat, had become a fertile ground for her deepest insecurities. Every reflective surface in her apartment, the window, the polished tabletop, even the glint in a spoon, told a similar story. That of a woman trapped in an inescapable loop of self-doubt and creeping terror. Desperation drove Elena to search for answers. She scoured books and obscure articles about haunted reflections and the psychology of isolation, seeking an explanation for the phenomenon that now defined her existence. Yet every theory only deepened her unease, suggesting that her experience was not unique, but a well-documented symptom of prolonged solitude. The more she learned, the more she felt that the mirror had become a silent judge of her inner life, a repository for all the fears and doubts that had accumulated in the long hours of isolation. In the final pages of her journal, Elena wrote of a chilling revelation. One evening, as she stared into the mirror, she felt as if the reflection reached out, a moment of connection that was both intimate and horrifying. It was as if the other presence, the one that had haunted her every waking moment, was not merely a trick of light and shadow, but a real, sentient fragment of her psyche. The isolation had given birth to an alter ego, one that whispered of hidden truths and unspoken terrors. In that moment, Elena understood that her mirror was not simply a passive observer, but an active participant in her slow descent into paranoia. The final entry in her journal ended with a single desperate sentence: "I am no longer alone in this reflection." Whether this was a confession of surrender to her unraveling mind, or a plea for salvation from the very isolation that had consumed her, it remained the ultimate testament to her tragic transformation. Elena's life, once defined by quiet resilience, had been irreversibly altered by the lonely confines of her own reflection, a reminder that even in a world filled with light, isolation can cast the darkest shadows. David found himself trapped in a vast, dilapidated building that time seemed to have forgotten. Originally built as an administrative center for a bustling organization, the structure had long been abandoned. Now, its endless corridors and empty rooms bore witness to the slow decay of both concrete and memory. For David, what began as a temporary refuge during a period of personal crisis soon became an unyielding prison of isolation and creeping paranoia. Each day, David wandered the silent corridors, as if in a daze, the building's oppressive stillness echoing the isolation that had taken root in his heart. The space was vast and unchanging, its walls a patchwork of peeling paint and faded notices of a bygone era. There was no warmth here, only the relentless passage of time and the lingering specter of loneliness. In the absence of human contact, David's thoughts turned inward, and every creak and sigh of the building was interpreted as a deliberate message, a communication from a presence that might be hidden just beyond his sight. In the early days, David attempted to impose order on his existence. He set routines, marked his progress through the building, and scribbled notes in a small diary to keep track of the days. But as the hours stretched on, his careful observations began to unravel into a tapestry of suspicion. Every time he passed a doorway or stepped into an empty room, a prickling sense of being observed seized him. He would stop in his tracks, as though waiting for someone to emerge from behind a closed door, only to find the space utterly vacant. Yet the feeling persisted, a quiet, insidious reminder that he might not be as alone as he believed. David's internal monologue grew increasingly fraught with doubt. He recalled the stories of the building's past, whispers of unexplained occurrences, of workers who had vanished without a trace, of corridors that seemed to rearrange themselves in the dead of night. Though he had once dismissed these tales as urban legend, the isolation and endless silence began to lend them an unsettling credibility. Every unexplained sound, every unexpected shift in the temperature of a room, became evidence of an unseen presence that stalked the corridors alongside him. The more David tried to rationalize these sensations, the deeper his paranoia became. He began to question the reliability of his own perceptions. Was the soft shuffle of footsteps behind him merely a figment of his imagination, or was there truly someone, or something, lurking in the shadows? The boundary between reality and hallucination blurred as he started to doubt the very solidity of the empty halls. His once clear sense of self became entangled with the oppressive atmosphere of the building, and he could no longer tell if the isolation was driving him to madness or if an external force was at work. In quiet moments of introspection, David documented his fears in careful, trembling prose. He wrote of corridors that seemed to stretch infinitely, of the haunting emptiness that pressed upon him with every step. His notes recounted fleeting glimpses of movement, a door that swung open without reason, a chair that appeared to be slightly shifted from its original position, and each detail was examined with the desperate precision of a man who believed his sanity hung in the balance. Every unexplained occurrence was a clue to a mystery that he could neither solve nor dismiss. A mystery that grew ever more urgent with the passing of each lonely day. One evening, as dusk settled over the deserted building, David found himself in a long, narrow corridor that he had not previously explored. The air felt heavier there, laden with the weight of untold secrets. With cautious steps, he ventured deeper into the passage, his heart pounding with a mixture of fear and a morbid need for answers. In that moment, the corridor seemed to pulse with an unseen life. Every shadow and every faint murmur suggesting that he was not, in fact, alone. The silence of that passageway was profound, a void into which his thoughts and fears were amplified. David felt that the building itself was aware of his presence, that it was guiding him toward something inevitable. A revelation of the isolation that had consumed him. In his mind, every step was fraught with meaning, every creak a deliberate signal. He began to whisper to himself in a bid to dispel the oppressive solitude, but even his own voice felt strange and alien in that space. As the hours passed in that silent corridor, David's fear transformed into a stark realization. The isolation he endured had become both his sanctuary and his tormentor. The vast emptiness was not merely a physical condition, but a reflection of his inner state, a labyrinth of doubt and unspoken terror. His mind, left unchecked in the barren confines of the building, had constructed an adversary from the very substance of his isolation. The presence he had so desperately sought to rationalize was, in truth, a projection of his own deepest anxieties, a relentless reminder that when one is truly alone, every shadow can become a threat. In the final moments of that long evening, as David emerged from the corridor into a room bathed in the dim light of dusk, he paused to record one final entry in his diary. With trembling hand, he wrote, "I have wandered these halls until I can no longer discern my own thoughts from the echoes of this place. The isolation is absolute, and my mind is the architect of my terror." The words were a quiet admission that, in the silence of the abandoned building, his own paranoia had become his only companion. Thus, David's story remained etched in the annals of the building, a testament to the power of isolation to warp perception and foster a terror that dwells not in external threats, but in the hidden recesses of the human mind. His journey through the silent corridors was not marked by grand escapes or dramatic confrontations, but by a slow, inexorable slide into the depths of solitary dread. In the realms of solitude, every echo becomes a whisper and every shadow a secret. As isolation feeds the flames of paranoia, remember, when you are alone, your mind may be the only enemy. Beware the silence that speaks to you.